Hey guys, welcome back to our sixth episode of the podcast for the National Security Clearance Lawyers Association. My name is Ryan Nerney, and I am a managing partner at the nationally recognized security clearance, military, and federal employment law firm, Tully Rinke. This is the very first podcast made to teach people from all industries that require a security clearance, the ins and outs of the security clearance process, what adjudicative bodies look for in potential disqualifying and mitigating conditions, and also what potential and common situations mean for your security clearance. So whether you're an employee for a government contractor, a federal employee, or a member of the military, we're hopeful and believe you will be able to pick up some tidbits of useful information here when you listen to the NSLA podcast. As I mentioned before, this is episode 6 of our podcast. So in today's podcast, we're going to continue our series where we talk about the specific adjudicative guidelines for security clearances. We previously spoke about Guideline A, B, C, and D. However, today we're going to go a little bit out of order and we're going to speak about Guideline F, which is financial considerations. By the end of this episode, you'll have a general understanding regarding what adjudicators typically look for regarding Guideline F cases and the disqualifying and mitigating conditions for this particular guideline. So if you've tuned in any of our last 5 episodes, you learned that any adjudicator focuses their review on 13 adjudicative guidelines, and this is disclosed in the Security Executive Agent Directive 4, pursuant to the Executive Order 12968. So this consists of 13 adjudicative guidelines A through M, and I mentioned before, today we're going to talk about Guideline F, and this is one of, if not the most common guidelines that we come across for all government agencies. So talking about Guideline F, financial considerations is what it's titled in the Seed 4. Guideline F relates to financial concerns. So the most common thing we see is a failure to pay debts, delinquent debts, unwillingness to satisfy debts, failure to pay and file your taxes, things of that nature. However, financial considerations also, and less frequently to be fair, encompasses gambling or financial fraud or any nefarious financial conduct that could be considered and could also be intertwined with some criminal conduct as well. And that could obviously elicit additional guidelines in addition to Guideline F. But, while Guideline F is one of the most common guidelines that we see, it is honestly one of the more straightforward guidelines that we have, especially as it relates to mitigation. So some of the disqualifying conditions that we typically see for Guideline F are an inability to satisfy debts, an unwillingness to satisfy debts, if there is a history of not meeting financial obligations, consistent and irresponsible spending beyond one's means. And this doesn't necessarily have to be one individual. It could be, somebody's spouse where, the person who's trying to get a clearance is, a card holder or something like that with their spouse. Their spouse goes on a, irresponsible spending spree, and that could essentially elicit this as well. Or any failure to pay federal, state, or local taxes, and as I mentioned before, financially fraudulent behavior. So there are a total of 9 disqualifying conditions that could be applicable. The main ones are the ones I just referenced, but there are 9 that potentially could be used. Some of them are a little bit more broad that kind of encompass a little bit more things, but ultimately that's what adjudicators look at in order to determine disqualifying conditions that may be applicable to specific fact patterns. Now, obviously, if you've listened to our other episodes, that comes with the disqualifying conditions. There's also the mitigating conditions that are applicable as well. So the mitigating conditions that are common and we typically see in regards to Guideline F are the behavior occurred so long ago and under unique or unusual circumstances. The financial issues arose due to circumstances beyond a person's control. This can encompass, let's say, a divorce, a business downturn, unexpected medical emergency, job loss or unemployment, identity theft, or even predatory lending practices. These are the most things that we see when it comes to, those unique circumstances. But on top of these unique circumstances, the mitigating conditions also require that a person act reasonably and responsibly under those circumstances. So this essentially means that you just can't sit and wait for your credit to improve or a debt to fall off your credit report. You must take responsible and good faith actions to actually remedy those outstanding debts. Sometimes I've even seen circumstances where a debt no longer appears on a current credit report, but the government has an old one that shows it was charged off or something along those lines. And in that event, just because it fell off your credit report is not enough to mitigate that particular debt. So it's important to understand that when you're talking about Guideline F cases. This also holds true for taxes. So if there are unique circumstances related to why a person didn't file or pay their taxes and they have since remedied that, this is also a mitigating condition as well. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but a lot of times when it comes to taxes, you can use the combat zone exemption. That's specifically for federal, but there are a lot of states that have something similar that you can also argue. So those are the typical common mitigating conditions that we see when it comes to Guideline F. So the general issues that typically elicit the Guideline F concern, as I said before, there's a lot of topics that can cover this guideline and elicit and trigger this guideline. However, the most common issues that we see are delinquent debts. And I want to put an emphasis on delinquent because just because you have a large amount of debts doesn't mean that this guideline will be triggered if you're not delinquent on those debts. So you can have a lot of debts, whether it's student loans, whether it's credit card, whether it's car payments, whatever it is. But if you're actively and consistently making timely payments on those debts, that usually will not trigger a Guideline F case or allegation unless there's some sort of nefarious conduct in relation to that. I've also seen situations where there's a failure to pay or file your taxes on time. And this is not just related to federal. It could also be state and local, even property taxes I've seen on statement of reasons. So things along that nature can also elicit a Guideline F allegation or concern. I've also seen in my practice situations where financial fraud has been alleged as well. Now, this is kind of rare, but I have seen it where individuals have been accused of money laundering allegations, have been accused of financial fraud, whether it's loan fraud, mortgage fraud, things along those lines where individuals have been accused of engaging in that type of nefarious conduct. So those also can fall under Guideline F as well as potentially some other guidelines, but specifically Guideline F would elicit those types of things. So those are the typical most common scenarios that we see, but I would say 90% of what we see is either delinquent debts or taxes and a failure to take action on those delinquent debts or the taxes. So obviously there are some, unique circumstances that I've seen in some situations that I've seen. I've done hundreds of these types of cases before, and many of these cases involve delinquent debts, but you're usually able to resolve those if there is a good faith effort taken. This can be something as small as even making or establishing a payment plan of even $20 a month, even if that debt is significant. So it's really important to utilize those resources that you have. Sometimes it could be a debt consolidation company. Sometimes it could be just reaching out to the creditors. But it's really important, and one of the main things to do to get mitigation under a Guideline F allegation is to reach out and try and make some sort of good faith effort to resolve that debt. There's also options if you absolutely don't owe that debt, which can sometimes happen through identity theft or other means. You can dispute that, and you can provide proof of the dispute. That is also something that is taken into account as far as mitigation goes. I also mentioned previously the combat zone exemption. So the combat zone exemption is for people who are deployed overseas in a combat zone. They're typically allowed to file and or pay their taxes within a certain period of time after they get back from their deployment. This doesn't necessarily have to be with just military members. It can be with government contractors as well. So those are typically things that you can see and argue in relation to tax issues. I've also been able to successfully mitigate concerns related to that with individuals who have been overseas for years. And then ultimately, once they get back, they end up taking care of their tax obligations. So ultimately, the best way to mitigate Guideline F allegations and cases is to just make sure that you're making a good faith effort to resolve it. Also, just to kind of touch on this a little bit, any bankruptcy that you file, whether it's Chapter 7 or Chapter 13, it's not a nail in the coffin. Many adjudicators take into account any unique circumstances that caused the bankruptcy to be filed in the first place, and that kind of goes to the mitigating conditions I was previously discussing. So while each case, especially under Guideline F, is looked at individually, simply doing nothing and hoping that the debt goes away or falls off your credit report is almost a surefire way to not only get a statement of reasons issued, but have your clearance denied or revoked if nothing is done. So those are the common things we see under Guideline F. And that there you have it for this month's NSLA podcast episode. Please keep a lookout for more content to assist with your current and future security clearance journeys. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.